Hello everyone and welcome to the Intelligence Squared Economic Outlook in partnership with Guinness Global Investors. I'm Connor, Head of Programming at Intelligence Squared. I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight for Keyu Jin and Johnny Diamond for the second of our Economic Outlook series of the year. The first was with Martin Wolf, and our next two later on in the year we're going to be announcing very soon, so do keep an eye on the Intelligence Squared newsletter to see those too. Also, just to say, we're really excited to be working with Guinness Global Investors as part of this series, and for those of you that don't know, Guinness Global Investors is an independent British fund manager that helps individuals and institutions harness the future driver, or the drivers of future growth to achieve their investment goals. And with specialisms in Asia, innovation, sustainability and income investing, they offer funds for the core of any equity portfolio. So for more information about Guinness, do speak to your financial advisor or just visit the Guinness Global Investors website. That's all from me, and I'm going to hand you over to our chair for this evening. So please give a warm welcome to the BBC journalist and royal correspondent, Johnny Diamond.
Thank you. Thank you, Connor. Thank you very much indeed. Hello and welcome to the Intelligence Squared Economic Outlook in partnership with Guinness Global Investors. I am Johnny Diamond, and I'm delighted to introduce our guest tonight, Keyu Jin, who is an Associate Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He has worked with China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. She has managed to straddle several worlds, or several parts of our world. She was born and raised in Beijing before going to the United States for university, gaining her PhD in economics from Harvard, and she now lives between London and Beijing, and it sounds like many other airports from what you've just been saying. Her latest book, which we'll be touching on some of the themes of this evening, is The New China Playbook, Beyond Socialism and Capitalism. And if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. It's both full of very urgent and passionate argument, and it is that rare thing from an academic, extraordinarily well written. So I really do recommend it. The format for tonight is relatively simple. Keyu and myself will talk for about 40 minutes. Then we'll open up the floor to you, open up the discussion rather to the floor, and to those of you who are watching online. If you want to put a question online, I have a handy iPad here which will receive your question. You just click the Q&A button under the video screen and press send, and I will mix and match between questions from the audience here and questions online, and we really do want to hear your questions. Let's kick off, if we could, Keyu, with it's always a difficult one because we talk about the global economy as if it was one thing. But if you can give us a picture of how you see the global economy over the next, 12 months, 18 months, what you see, the challenges and the opportunities. Let's hear that.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's great to talk to you, Johnny. And so starting with the global economy, it depends on where we're talking about. We have a couple of elections, quite important elections next year, and there seems to be a rise in uncertainty. But despite everything, the fastest growing countries, the three fastest growing countries in the world this year and next year, and probably in the foreseeable future, are all in Asia. They are India, China still, and Indonesia. So we have to, still keep in mind that more than half, or 60% of the growth is going to come from that region, and that region is going to account for half of the middle income group in the next few years. Now, that said, I think there's reasons to be concerned as well. Maybe not in the next year or a couple years, but really seeing a global reorganization and change in globalization. Yeah. And that has a lot to do with US-China relations, but that started already a few years ago. So US-China trade has permanently come down on a downward trend. But the new form of trade is happening through third countries now. So Vietnam and Mexico have suddenly seen huge increases, not only in trade, but also investment, FDI. So what's essentially happening is China is moving their factories, moving their investment, setting up shop in Mexico and Vietnam, and then exporting from there. But guess what? The ultimate source of demand and supply are still the two largest economies in the world, China, US. So you're basically just adding to the trade costs. And the same thing is going to happen with innovation. I'm sure we're going to talk about that. There's a global, reorganization of investment. A lot of global capital is flowing back to Japan and South Korea, and Japan's seeing a boom after the lost decade. But the rising protectionism, that's what we have to worry about. We have to keep in mind that globalization is the single biggest contribution to reducing global inequality. And if you look at the vast majority of people in the world, 90% of them, they're still living in developing countries, but they will have to suffer the consequences of rising protectionism and global fragmentation.
How much of that still astonishing growth of the big three that you mentioned, how much of that is export-led? How much of it could be crimped by rising protectionism?
Well, in Asia, there are countries are in very different stages of development. China is different from India, which is different from Cambodia, and Vietnam, which is different from Bangladesh. And the vast majority of them still rely a lot on export-led growth. China, for sure, is, first of all, still wants to embrace globalization. But, there are parallel changes as well. So self-sufficiency, trying to master critical components, kind of like the de-risking that Europe is talking about. US is obviously trying to build up massively its domestic industry. In China's mind, that can all happen in parallel. You don't have to give up globalization to be self-reliant in certain sectors. I also feel that the big worry is countries everywhere around the world is dropping the pro-growth agenda. We're taking it for granted that growth being front and center has been a recent thing. I think about all the countries around talking about national security. China has talked about common prosperity, lots of domestic politics and populism and all of that. And inequality, of course, it's very important, but the pro-growth agenda, I think it should come back front and center because most developing countries have not recovered from the pandemic. Look at the surging debt, the rising indebtedness, but also in the US, for heaven's sake, the fiscal deficit. These are real challenges for the global economy, but growth is no longer the focal point here.
Can we talk about AI? Because the race for AI supremacy is one of the big headlines. It seems to be heating up as well, with the Biden administration announcing it's going to halt shipments to China of advanced AI microchips. How important do you think that race for AI supremacy will be to the global economy, to the relationship between those two superpowers?
So I think that the source of US-China tension is about the Chinese development model, Chinese aspirations, but most critically, it's over Chinese technology. It's over technological competition. That, I think, is the single biggest source of rivalry between the two, because as we know, in the next, going forward, who masters high-tech and critical technology is going to really not only shape all future global technologies, but whether it's economic, military consequences. And over time, I think, in the 1980s or something, only 10-15% of technologies were dual use. Now it's something like 70-80%. So this is really the core source of tension between the two countries. I think that we're going to see two parallel kind of developments of technological development. There's nothing that's going to stop China's technological development. It's just they're moving forward. But I think that what people have failed to understand is that, or failed to potentially see, is that this is actually going to accelerate China's critical technology development rather than hold it down. I mean, there are many, many historical instances from the Napoleon blockade to the Germans in the two world wars. Every time you restrict technological exports, and this is also true with Japan, or their blockades, it actually mobilizes the entire nation and pushes them to actually achieve even a greater mobilize the entire country's resources to overcome these restrictions, and we're already seeing that with China. So Huawei, almost got killed, the handset business with the U.S. sanctions. Guess what? It's now come back to the best-selling handset in China, but seen, multiple folds of profits and growth, but also expanding in all different areas. Semiconductors, domestic Chinese semiconductors companies have seen something 6-fold increase in profits. Even the average increase in profits is something like 30% for many publicly listed companies. Why? Because all the demand for chips, and by the way, China imports as much chips as it does oil, is all coming back to Chinese domestic companies. If you're an AI company, if you're an Chinese EV company, you're not going to be very comfortable still relying on NVIDIA chips, right? You're going to substitute for domestic chips. The irony is that usually it's the domestic government, like a Chinese government, that will force you to adopt domestic components. Now, actually, U.S. is volunteering on China's behalf. And so we can see potential leapfrogging in China. Even in the short term, it might be painful. But we're also seeing a whole techno-nationalism at the macro level. Everybody's so geared up and mobilized to do technology. All the big techs from Tencent to Alibaba, they're all tackling AI and chips even. Yeah. They would have not had the motivation had it not been for these sanctions. By the way, there's a going joke. Chinese people are like, whoa, this is not that bad, what happened. By the way, President Biden, do you mind also sanctioning our national men's football team too?
Can we drill down into, your own experience of the transformation that's happened in China, in your lifetime? I know it's too big simply to deal with, let alone in one evening, let alone in a short answer. But can you give us a sense of that transformation?
The transformation was really remarkable. I, for one, had been already born in a relatively privileged generation compared to my parents' generation. But even for my family, we started out with an 11 square meter, I should probably talk about square feet, so let's say 100 square feet apartment, which was a privilege, and communal kitchen, really a privilege. And I remember 4 or 5 blackouts per week when I was growing up in Beijing. And then 5 years later, people seemed to, all the buildings were coming up. Every summer when I came back from the US to visit Beijing, I could barely recognize it. But the growth was palpable. In many other countries, you see the numbers, but you don't actually see it, on the ground, at least not that rapidly. And somehow it's been dispersed maybe into the hands of the wealthy. But in China, you really saw it and felt it. And so compared to my parents' generation, kind of the huge physical and hardships, right, vicissitudes, our generation was just really saw China on the rise. And so I think despite everything, and when I came to the US, I was only 14, people depicted China as it was like a very backward, horrific place to be in. Yeah. But that was the country that was bidding for the Olympics before the 2000s and joining the WTO. Everyone's so excited to be opening up. They were so excited about changing rules, changing their, kind of choices just to fit with the WTO conditions, and you can see palpable excitement. But that was black and white, night and day, compared to the impression about China in America when I first got there in 1997. And by the way, the gap has not really reduced by that much over the last 20 years.
The perception also colors the commentary now. And I think probably everyone in this room has read an article predicting the collapse of the Chinese economy, or certainly the recession that's going to come. Why is it, do you think, that so much commentary in the UK, in the US, is focusing on the downside with China and has got it so wrong year after year after year?
Since the 1980s, there have been 6 different versions of the China collapse story, none of which has transpired, and now it's currently peak China. Now, I'm sure we're going to come back to the current economic situation. Yeah. It's a challenging situation, but I wouldn't quite call it peak China. I think that's a misconceived notion. First of all, China has fostered a pretty unique model of how to grow, how to develop, that is unlike conventional standards. It grew it is, by the way, the country that has grown the fastest for the longest period of time. Yeah. And it's quite remarkable given its size to be able to do that. But it's also defied a lot of conventional wisdom. But I think part of the reason I wanted to write my book is to suggest that there's not just one model that works. As a graduate student, as a Western trained economist, it's basically one model that makes things work. And I think that what China has offered, a very different form of, a combination of state mechanisms and markets, a huge role for state coordination and mobilization, which never features in any of our economic paradigms, have played a role. Not to say that there are not other challenges and fallacies, but I think the reason why we get it wrong is that we apply just one model, one standard. It has to fit these conditions, and without that, it's basically not going to work. And especially the role of the state. Yeah. We really, in our economics circle, there's very, very little role for the state, very little, except for when there are market failures or regulations. But in China, jump-starting the whole system required massive state coordination, and even coming back to today, the EV market. China managed to develop the biggest consumer and producer market for EVs within 10 years. Guess what happened? It does help that the state rolls out 4 million EV charging stations around the country, as opposed to 160,000 in the US.
I mean, what's fascinating is that in somewhere like the UK, the phrase picking winners is said with a sneer, because it's seen as the UK government has picked failures time and time again, and everyone picks, Concord or whatever it is that they wish to choose. That hasn't happened in China. Do you understand why the state gets it right, or got it right in China?
Well, first of all, I agree that picking winners is very difficult to do for the state, but that's not China's model. Now, we all think about China's models as being extremely centralized, right? That's our impression about China. It's only partially correct. It's political centralization coupled with an extreme form of economic decentralization. Right. So in fact, all the economic policies and implementation were up to the local officials to implement. So this massive decentralization, rolling out the reforms, and this partnership between governments enabling private entrepreneurs were really essential to kind of that making that success. So it wasn't the subsidies, it wasn't the the kind of the picking winners, the industrial policies. It was that these mayors, I call this the mayor economy in my book. They were very incentivized to do a good job in their local jurisdiction, because they wanted to be promoted, they want fiscal resources, they wanted to create GDP, so they helped the best and most productive private entrepreneurs. They helped them succeed. Right. And if you're not the UK or US that has a very ease of doing business and good rule of law, you really do need the government's help. Right. But this chicken and egg thing, jump-starting development or innovation, and that's China's current focus, the state played a big role.
Let us talk about the future. You write in your book, in a phrase that Guinness Global investors may recognize, what has happened in China offers no reliable indicator of what lies ahead. You are, however, optimistic about China's economic future.
Let me put it this way. I'm concerned about China's current economic situation. But to put things into perspective, there have been 12 economic recessions in the US in the last 6 or 7 decades or so. This is China's first official economic recession, deep economic recession, but economic recession nevertheless. By the way, it took US 10 years to recover from the Great Recession. So we got to ask the question, is this cyclical, the kind of boom and bust cycles that all these market economies experience, or is it a permanent decline? Now, the peak China theory seems to suggest it's a permanent decline because of the relationship between the state and entrepreneurs, the demographics. But really, it's China was the last to exit from the pandemic. There's been a significant real estate downturn. Chinese households never got stimulus support, right? Never got a package to help them. U.S. spent $5 trillion on a COVID, economic recession that officially lasted for 2 months. They had a massive package. Also, China's size, given its current stage of development, inevitably it's going to grow slower. And by the way, even if India grows 5 percentage points faster than China for the next until 2030, China is still going to contribute $176 trillion more of GDP than India is. It's just that sheer size. But what I wanted to really emphasize is that in terms of where China is today and China's potential, that's where I am a little bit more optimistic. Just this massive gap to fill. In what sense? There's almost still 1 billion people who's living under $300 per month. They're not really yet middle income. There's 176 million migrant workers who, if they had the proper social protection, Social Security protection, all that, they would unleash at least $1 trillion RMB of additional consumption. Service sector, 80% share of GDP here in the US, it's only 50% in China. When economies like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, when they stagnated, their growth level kind of leveled off, their productivity level was already at 80% of the US's. China today is 20%. So there's still a massive gap, and there's convergence that we see historically and across the countries. And that's why I'm saying don't write China off. It's still the second largest economy. It's still going to grow at a reasonable rate. It's not going to be spectacular like the last few decades, but there's a huge room of convergence to be looking for here.
Can we talk about demographics? As you know, some people say demographics is destiny. We've got the one-child policy and its impact, and then you've got a divide mirrored around the world in various different ways between young versus old as well. Can you just talk about the different forces playing on the Chinese economy?
Well, first of all, I have a little bit of a contrarian view when it comes to aging and demographics, and I just don't think this is the first-order challenge for China. I think the first-order challenge for China is if they give up the pro-growth agenda, as I mentioned. But I don't think demographics is. And here, let me tell you why. First of all, just looking across countries, there's been some recent, very robust and serious academic studies that have shown that demographic aging causing a slowdown in growth and reduction in per capita income was true before 1990. That relationship completely reversed after 1990. Why? The arrival of technology and automation. And so aging countries tend to adopt these technologies more rapidly and also spread them across different sectors. So actually, Asian countries became the richer countries after the post-1990 sample. Now, China accounts for about 50% of industrial robot exports. Were China really concerned about the reduction in labor force? Very, very quickly, they can replace a labor force with robotics. And by the way, there's still a massive number of undereducated rural population whose wages are way below the market rates that they can tap into. So in the end, it's really about productivity. It's about labor productivity, it's about how to engage with things like new technologies like AI, which is going to displace labor anyways. It's not so much the number of people in the population. So if demographics didn't explain China on the way up, I doubt that it was explain China on the way down.
You've also written about your generation, generation born in, the 80s, the 90s, the noughties, being a distinct break from the past. Another generation will come along. Do you sense another break coming, or do you think there is more continuity because the system has shifted already?
China currently has, probably my generation and post-90s compared to my parents' generation, probably represents the biggest generational gap in China. But I really think that the new generation will change the economic and potentially political landscape for China. So my parents' generation, through all the hardship, they're risk averse. They are massive savers. All the international controversies that we've had with China exporting too much or saving too much, well, that's about to change with the new generation. 85% of domestic consumer credit is accounted by 35 and under.
Right.
University students have no hesitation, despite having no income. One click on Taobao, which is Alibaba's e-commerce website, borrow the money to buy a lipstick. I don't know how they repay. Maybe their parents are paying it back, but they are a borrowing, spending generation. Huge amount of spending, a focus on apparel, entertainment, leisure, traveling. Unlike their saving, parents. And by the way, why is it? It's a puzzle that I write in my book about how is it that an average young 20-something, early 30-something person can afford apartments at San Francisco prices when the average income in that city is about a tenth of San Francisco income. Well, there are 6 wallets behind the 20-something person, that person's spouse and their parents, and maybe the grandparents would all chip in. So we got to take into account the fact that culture also plays a role and maybe changes the Chinese families. But most importantly, I like to talk about the new generation of the Chinese because it's not just the consumption habits, the economic landscape. They're extremely open-minded. Many of them have studied abroad. Something like, 500,000 students go abroad to study every year. They come back and they try to change the economic landscape and try to be entrepreneurial. All the international surveys show that they care about things like animal rights, diversity, likes to have diversity, very open religiously, and so to many, many other things, very much unlike the previous generations. So I think in terms of talking about the East and West and US and China, all that, they will be a better bridge between China and the rest of the world. And I think there's much more of a convergence between the millennials or the Gen Zs between China and the rest of the world than the previous generations.
You talk about the risk of veering away from the pro-growth agenda. Can you expand upon that? I mean, there will be some who think, why on earth would anyone veer away from the pro-growth agenda when it's done so well?
Yeah, well, see, I remember a few weeks ago I was talking to somebody, I don't know, in their 60s, and he was telling me in the 1980s, he was just utterly shocked when the country announced that the priority is now going to be on the economy and growth. So we really take it for granted, thinking that, of course, that's what everybody wants, right? Having seen all this. But back then, back in China then, it should be about ideology, it should be about politics, growth, economy, what's that for, And so that 40 years of focus on economic growth, everything, putting in everything to make sure that they ensure growth is really one of the first layer of why, first fundamental force of why China has become successful. Now, it's also the case and the fact that many countries, when they get to a certain level of income, they also drop the pro-growth agenda. Populist governments, they start to think about, redistribution, but not in the right ways, not in the economically feasible and effective ways. I don't think China's going there, but there's always, but now there's, security, right? National security concerns. Of course, there's rising geopolitics. You always somehow fear that economic is no longer front and center. But here, I want to point out that in China, it's a pendulum swing, that the goals often shift depending on the circumstances of the day. Now, there was a lot of confidence pre-pandemic, but after, and especially in the last couple of years where the economy has really slid, you can see visibly that pragmatism has returned. And I always say that there's more Mao in times of confidence, but Deng in times of a crisis. So Deng Xiaoping, more pragmatism. You've seen a slew of policies coming out recently supporting the private sector, so kind of rolling back some of the regulatory crackdowns we've seen in the past. There have been massive efforts to open up the economy, to lure back capital. I mean, even something small like visa-free travel, something that China has never done, just meant to lure back, kind of get foreigners to come back, showing to the world, signaling that China's open for business. These are very practical measures, but that's only been recent.
You also write a growing consciousness, you write of a growing consciousness that what is economically efficient may not be socially desirable. And that presumably is pushing back on the pro-growth agenda.
Absolutely. This is going to be a very important agenda still going forward. There's several angles to look at this. First is, in China, some leaders believe that China should not be looking more and more like the US, in particular where politics sing to the tunes of capital. They rather like it the other way around, where there's obviously massive inequality and divisiveness and the chaos, kind of the angst, the social angst that has caused many American citizens. Why do we see many crackdowns on technology companies, on education companies? Now there's recently something about gaming, because I think it's a journey to find out, can there be less inequality? Can there be more inclusive growth? Can the big techs behave and think about protect consumers? I mean, all of that, we're sympathetic to that because that's something that the world has talked about. But China has done it faster and implemented a lot of these policies faster than other countries. Now, not to say that these are the right things to do or the right ways to implement them, but I think the agenda of expanding beyond just economic growth to think about social equity and social harmony is going to be one of the defining features going forward.
You touched on the sort of backlash in particular from the US. A couple of big examples has been Huawei, more recently TikTok, and the demand from Congress that it be separated from any relationship with the Chinese company. Aside from stimulating domestic growth in these industries, what do you think the impact will be?
Well, people ask me, what is the China model? And I said, just read Jake Sullivan's speech on how to restore American competitiveness, and there you get the China model. It looks pretty. The U.S. is looking more and more like China, and China also tries to copy U.S. free markets. We've seen these massive Chips and Science Acts, Inflation Reduction Acts, hundreds of billions of dollars of industrial policies. And by the way, China did not invent industrial policies. If you look at it in the data, actually the richer countries are more aggressive users of industrial policies. But certainly we've seen a return, even with Europe. Even with Japan, that's allocated hundreds of billions of dollars to restore a Japanese kind of high tech, or focus on Japanese high tech. So we're seeing rising protectionism, an arms race, industrial policies, and so this is also coming back to your first question, a little bit worrying about what that kind of global landscape would start to look like. But the TikTok issue, yes, now it's the question is, can we really keep the small yard, high fence strategy, right? Because as we mentioned, now the majority of technologies or high tech are going to be dual use. Is it going to include EVs? Now we've seen the recent increase in tariffs in EVs. Is it going to overflow to lots of other consumer products? So this is it might be a vicious circle where we're headed.
How concerned are you about Taiwan? Because there's this alleged window of military superiority that China has, and it's a long-term ambition, as many here will know, that China wishes to reunify with Taiwan. And yet the economic consequences seem pretty much unthinkable.
I think, with the Russian-Ukrainian war, this very unified response of the Western economies goes to show that there's a real international reaction that I think China would certainly heed. The fact that modern warfare, right? How much information do you have on these parameters is also a question that Chinese leaders will heed. But really, first of all, the domestic challenges in China, they're pretty important. For China, the priority is still domestic. It's not international. It's actually, despite what we think, not about the US. It's still about the economic, day-to-day social challenges in China. I wouldn't underestimate how much Chinese people desire peace. Now, for everything that we've heard, focused on the president's speeches, we also have not focused on the premier's speech, public announcement in Davos this year that China is not going to tolerate chaos, including military chaos, in the region. That's as much as a signal as I think China's premier can give. So there are also lots of other, let's say, strategies or tools or instruments, including blockades, trade, economic relations, economic tools that China can let's say resort to, where the last option would be military confrontation. And I think another thing to keep in mind is that Taiwan's and China's economy are both inextricably linked. And so the rising uncertainty that have caused a reduction in demand for investment in the region is not only in China, but also in Taiwan. And 30%, something like 30% of Taiwanese investment actually comes from mainland China. So all that is to say, I personally don't expect much movement in the short term. And also coming back to the generational angle, this is a one-child policy generation of soldiers, right?
Yeah.
Every family has only one child, so I wouldn't underestimate how much Chinese people value peace.
Just a quick reminder and an opportunity for you to have a drink if you'd like one. We'll be taking questions in about 10 minutes' time. We have a couple of questions online. Do send them in if you're watching at home or from the office. You just click the Q&A button under the video screen and press send. Thank you very much for the questions you've sent in so far. Much of the success, as I understand from what you wrote, much of the success has been based on what you see as the differences between the Chinese model and the model that perhaps is taught in economics faculties, in particular the role of the state, but also the mindset of the people. Is one that is very cognizant of the privations of the past, of the incredible challenges individually that people faced in the past. They will fade, won't they? You will have a generation that has grown up in prosperity, that does not save so much, you've already talked about that perhaps does not want to work so much, that perhaps values the environment more than it does sort of growth and economic success. Do you see China becoming more like the rest of the world? Do you see a stopping point in that? Do you see great cultural gaps between China and the countries that it would like to economically emulate?
I think it is a cycle of renewal in the sense that the Chinese new generation, than just working hours. They're no longer the generation like the Foxconn workers who opted for 3 shifts a night and just so eager to earn an additional yuan. They like to work hard. They're entrepreneurial, but they also like to spend. And in that sense, maybe that is not such a bad thing, right? Because remember globalization and the rise of China in the 2000s, this massive influx of products, cheap and huge amount of scale. The Chinese people worked so hard and they learned so fast. That was undeniably a shock to the world. Now, a lot of these jobs are passed down to other countries, passing the baton back, to other countries that also have a chance to emerge and develop through manufacturing. And so China's focus has totally shifted. It's no longer about the traditional manufacturing steel. China's new agenda is emerging strategic new sectors like EVs, like renewables, like high techs and critical technologies. And so now, one interesting thing I have to say is that despite all that is happening, the lower wages, moving to other countries, we don't really see in the newspapers, in the Chinese newspapers, about Vietnamese stealing Chinese jobs, or with this bitterness, right? What do the Chinese do? They say, well, this is just a natural cycle. Let's try to upgrade on the value chain. Let's invest in other sectors, and let's try to climb up and shift to other sectors. So the mentality is still very different. But back to the new generation, it's a good thing because they have, they're going to start spending. They also love traveling and seeing the world. And so I think some of the old controversies are no longer really that relevant anymore. But they also love to transform the domestic economic landscape. Post-80s, Manor Coffee, it's a coffee shop, hundreds of stores within 3 years trying to kind of compete with Starbucks. So I think the attitude is pretty positive with the new generation.
As I probably don't need to tell quite a lot of our guests, there was a period, a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, where suddenly China was declared uninvestable. And there'd been a sweeping series of regulatory changes that seemed to come out of nowhere, and funds were pulling their money out at a rate of knots. How is it now, and how do you think it will be over the next sort of short to medium term for those looking for decent returns from China?
So before I answer that, I did want to say one more thing about the new generation,
Please.
which I think is very important, which is, I've talked about the positives, right? But there's a real challenge, which is there's a high youth unemployment, north of 25%. Who knows what the real numbers are? And I think that the building up of that anxiety, the whole families have spent so much, maybe sometimes empty their bank accounts to educate one child, have the prospect of not being able to find their first job, and that obviously brings a lot of angst, not only to the graduate, but also to the family. So I think this is something to think about. But also, this mismatch. When we talk about demographics being kind of the major thing, I'd say it's the big education skill mismatch. It's not like there are no jobs in China. There are actually 25 million additional manufacturing jobs in the next 3 years. But guess what? These young people are too educated for that. They don't want to choose that kind of jobs, even though that's what's available. So how if the nation manages to resolve that issue, is really one of the preconditions to actually unleash the potential of that generation.
And traditionally, and we will come back to this question of investment, but traditionally as well, graduate unemployment is politically quite destabilizing as well. It's a real challenge for government.
Absolutely.
Is it for China?
Well, I can assure you that the Chinese leaders really focus their attention on the young generation, right? Their credibility lies in the young generation's trust. Just think about how COVID ended. But they are actually actively trying to solve this problem. So examples like vastly expanding vocational training and schools, and also raising their status, and also trying to encourage companies to give internships. And there are many different measures. So they're taking it very seriously. I also do think that it has a lot to do with the economic downturn. So hopefully over time. But back to investment, very, very critical topic here. Now, look, I think U.S. investment is very, very important for the Chinese technological landscape. It's not just that China needs money. China doesn't actually need that much money. China has a huge amount of domestic saving rate. But U.S. investment or global international investors are supremely important for the innovation ecosystem. They're usually long-term, they're strategic, they can open doors. There are all kinds of benefits of having them around, and especially in China's somewhat immature, let's say, financial system that doesn't do a great job supporting small, medium-sized companies and entrepreneurs, they play a really critical role. Right. So I think having them back or keeping them there or encouraging them to take a look at China is very important. Now that said, those who want to do the work on understanding Chinese companies, doing work on the ground, they do see a lot of value and potential upside for Chinese companies currently. Still very, very good, very profitable, much, much more undervalued than it was before. And so you do also have a group of investors that are more, let's say, politically neutral, and they do price in the uncertainties about Taiwan and all the risk, but they're given the risk return calculation, they still believe that it is a good long-term bet. So you will also see that. And also the recent data have suggested that China is actually slowly coming back with the consumption growth numbers, inflation numbers, manufacturing numbers. It's probably slowly on their bottoming out over time. But we also have to remember that at this point, I believe that global capital is not only fickle, but it has a short memory span. Now, in the 1980s or 1990s, when countries like Argentina defaulted on their debt, financial penalty, financial exclusion of Argentina in the international markets were on average 3 to 5 years. In recent years, if you default on your debt, the average penalty is 3 to 6 months. And so global capital still needs to diversify. They're going to search for growth. And as we mentioned, despite what we're thinking about, Asia is still where the majority of the growth is happening. So if China can stabilize, if China's leaders can be regulatory agencies, bodies, and policies can be more transparent, stabilize, really encourage foreigners to come back and invest, and just show some stability and general pragmatism, I think there's a chance that global capital will flow back.
Do you think peak fear has been passed?
Well, actually, I think with recent Biden's decisions on tariffs on EVs, I know that it sounds like the tariff rates are very high, but they're actually not as stringent and not as important as they're better, they're more lax than expected, in the sense that, first of all, some of it doesn't take place until a few years later. It really concerns, it doesn't really affect China in the sense that, during the Trump administration, the tariffs were on goods of values of, $50 billion just on steel, hundreds of billions more. This is what, $18 billion? And Chinese exports of solar panels and EVs represent to U.S., Chinese exports to U.S. only represent less than 2% of Chinese total exports. Yeah. Not really relevant for China, with the exception of lithium batteries. So I think Biden's, kind of decision is a little bit more of a political show rather than substance, thinking, let's not really piss off China, but let's still show that we're committed to, making sure that we protect our domestic industries.
Thank you very much. I want to hear from you, if I can, and also from those of you who are watching online. Let's go to the audience first, if we may. We have a roving microphone. Gentleman in the stripy top there, first of all. Thank you. And then afterwards, the gentleman there has got his hand up. I'm an equal opportunities person as well, so I do want to hear from ladies in the audience. Sir, thank you.
Yeah. Hello. Excellent talk. Enjoyed it. A related question. The trade war will hit China more or America more? And, I've heard that locals prefer international products because of quality. Like my friend in China and has a young baby, they say, I'll never buy a Chinese diaper for them. So I just wanted your insight since you visit there and like that.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Why do you answer that one?
So it depends on who's going to be the next American president is part of the answer. But we have all known that, according to many studies, Americans ultimately paid for the tariffs that they imposed on not only Chinese products, but also European products. So I don't really think it's actually that effective. And I wouldn't say it's going to affect China very much for the reasons that I give, especially because it's focused on the renewables with China. Now, that comes back to the question of quality. Why is Chinese EVs such a threat to global competition? Because pretty much at every single price point, they have high quality, given that price point. So you can have a very good Chinese EV for $10,000 or $140,000 that directly competes with Tesla. So now China is not just trying to sell cheap products like it was in the past, but actually offering real quality. And a lot of it comes from this massive investment in innovation. And I'd argue certainly in the case for EVs and solar panels, that has driven down, kind of increased the quality and driven down the prices. So it's a new China now.
I'm going to take one of our online questions. It comes from Joel Calvin. Thank you. How do you perceive China's evolving interest in Africa's economic landscape? In your opinion, what are the potential opportunities and challenges associated with China-Africa Economic Association?
There is about a $1 trillion infrastructure gap every year in the whole world. And somebody, and many need to fill that together. Now, China's interest in Africa is both economic and strategic. They're both. They're not one or the either. China has massively invested in Africa and built infrastructure. Now, a lot of people think that has caused the rising levels of debt. Well, it is for sure true that Africa needs to have an economic ecosystem before it can fully utilize its infrastructure. But I think it's also a mistake to attribute the debts of these emerging markets to China, because 90% of developing countries' debt is actually held by Western financial institutions. That's what the data says. China needs more friends, so it's going to invest more in Africa, do more projects with Africa. But as I mentioned, there's also geopolitical strategy behind it.
Thank you very much. Sir.
Yeah, another geopolitical question. China's relationship with Russia and India, the kind of growing power in the region, I would argue. First of all, with Russia, an enfeebled, sort of kleptocratic state that's kind of really become a vassal state of China because of the oil exports, firstly. Secondly, India, growing power in the region, wants to compete, wants Western inward investment in order to compete in terms of technology. How do you see that playing out economically, those two different relationships?
Thank you.
Well, for sure, I'm just to give China's side of story, and this is, I guess, the objective of this. But I think Chinese leader sees a multipolar world, and it believes that there should be many powers, including Russia and India, and potentially Brazil, and of course Europe and U.S. and China. So in that sense, that's the kind of world vision that China has. India is going to be a competitor, right? But there's also, you can also see in some degrees or sometimes where India and China also think about collaboration. It's going to be a very interesting triangle or, multiple kind of relationship between US and India now getting closer because of competition, rivalry with China. So what does China do with Russia? Now, I understand that we all have our views about Russia, but first of all, China sees a substantially weakened Russia is not really a great thing for China. This is purely geopolitical, realpolitik, so to speak. It finds itself in a dilemma. On the one hand, from its principles and diplomacy, it certainly does not approve of any kind of foreign invasion, but at the same time, estrangement with Russia also means that more attention is directed towards China, U.S. focus on China. So I think these are moving pieces, but it's certainly going to be kind of a more multipolar dynamic, but also the huge push of BRICS country, right? Even common currency, multiple trading blocks, regional trading blocks, lots of financial centers, central banks, swap lines, and all of that. We're seeing a huge parallel movement outside of the Western countries to try to create a different, kind of multipolar world.
Let's have another one that's coming online. Looking ahead, this is from Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. Looking ahead, what are your insights regarding the future trajectory of brick and mortar retail compared to e-commerce in China?
Interesting question. Well, China's digital economy is something like 40% of GDP. In the US, it's only about 10%, and China wants to build up that even further. And so I think the digital economy is absolutely where China is headed towards, and it concerns data, a data processing center, and of course all that triangle of AI, communications, and data is going to be a core pillar, these three pillars for China going forward. So I think the Chinese government is certainly pushing for more digital economy. But of course, online, offline, China has the most innovative business models, and depending on the sector, they try to make it work. So there will be a mix of both.
Thank you very much. There's a lady over there. Thank you.
Thank you. Something that really struck me with what you said when talking about the likelihood of military encroachment in Taiwan, you said, this is the one-child generation. Think about that. Don't underestimate how much the Chinese people value peace. And that really struck me because, I haven't heard it before. And I feel as though it brought a level of humanism into the analysis that I don't often see reflected. And I wonder if, when you look at how UK media, UK commentators, Western commentators perceive China, do you feel that China is often dehumanized, decultured, and seen through quite a cynical geopolitical, economic lens? And as a result, is our analysis missing the mark?
Thank you so much. Thank you. Keyu.
Well, thank you for this excellent question, and thank you for pointing out something really important, which is humanism and humanity. And that obviously exists in a country with 1.4 billion people. So I think that is a very important element to consider. Despite the fact that the states might not see eye to eye, the people still can and still do. The vast majority of people in China, as I mentioned, not even in real middle income by international standards, what do you think their priorities are, right? It's about their children. It's about putting bread on the table. It's still overwhelmingly pragmatic, and it's about their children's future. So in that sense, I think nationalism hasn't taken over the country. It's not China pitted against the West or China pitted in the U.S. Actually, these discussions are not even really encouraged in the social media platforms and so forth. So I think coming back to the media, well, if you consistently depict a country, especially one that has been pretty successful negatively, and this is obviously not just the UK, but also the US, I think, there is something wrong with that narrative, right? The narrative is complex. It's much more nuanced. For all the great successes that China has, as I've written in my book, there are huge challenges. There are huge costs. The question is ultimately always, do the benefits outweigh the cost? Because no model is perfect. No system is perfect. But I'd like to see China still improving on many, many different levels, including the human part of it compared to many decades ago. It's really, really a different country. So I think, focusing on the Chinese people, American people, people here in Europe is the right thing to do. And what is most sad is that universities are losing their connections. And there's less and less research, science research collaboration between Chinese and American scientists. And that is really sad because, think about all the transnational challenges that we have, whether it's environment or health. People want to, find a cure for cancer. They have to work together, all these things. So we're seeing less of that. And that, I think, is really troubling, especially given that I was an exchange student to America. I was very thankful to the U.S. to give, opportunities to international students. But that also is starting to, we're starting to see a decline. So frustrated.
You mentioned climate. We have a question that's come in online on that. To what extent, this is from Tommy Edwards, to what extent do you think that China's 2060 carbon neutral target is attainable?
Well, China likes to come out with these grandiose and ambitious plans and targets, and everyone have a target. They will kind of, mobilize the entire country to work towards a goal. It's a challenging situation because on the one hand, China what accounts for 2/3 of global investment in renewables, so really actively investing in renewables and also cleaning up the environment in a very, very effective way. But it still has to take into account development, right? The vast majority of countries still need to rise. There's huge energy consumption demands, and there's still, a demand for coal. So it's going to try to walk that very fine line. So I don't know if it will, but I think that, given the commitment levels, it is potentially feasible.
Thank you, and thanks to Tommy. Thank you for that question. Another question from the audience. Gentleman there in the purple, yes, you, sir, in the purple tie.
Thank you. Thank you for an excellent talk. I wanted to ask, how would you compare China's development model to Japan's post-war development model, and especially in the context of what some experts suggest, that China's current challenges might be very similar to what Japan faced in the early 90s. Would you say there's a risk of China following that lost decades path? And if not, what would be the key difference in the model that could prevent that? Thank you.
Thank you. We have a sort of something of a mirror of that question online as well. How big a problem could deflation be in China, similar to what happened in Japan? So both aspects, if you could.
Well, first of all, Japan was already a rich country when it hit the lost decade, and China's far from a rich country in all sense of the word. Even urbanization rate, when we talk about Japanese real estate, China's urbanization is still 10 percentage points below Japanese peak urbanization rate during the peak housing crisis. So I think they're in different stages of development. I'd say that the one similarity I would have a concern about is the banking system. Dominant in the financial industry, a huge amount of exposure to the real estate, and now we're seeing a real estate downturn. Of course, China is not going to let a massive asset bubble collapse like the one that we saw in Japan, because it's controlled. It's not really market determined. So to that extent, it will shield some of these massive wealth effects compared to Japan. So apart from that, one concern I have is about policies and how the Japanese policymakers did not come up with a very effective stimulus package to deal with what they thought was a structural economic decline, whereas it was kind of a short-term one. Now, if Chinese policymakers repeat that of not giving enough support to the economy, then I think that the trajectory might be a little bit more similar.
Thank you. Madam, you had a question. Thank you.
Thank you for speaking today. I actually watched one of your speeches in Minnesota, I think early this year, and something that you touched on was IP and the difference between IP regulation in China and the US, and I think that's really interesting. How do you see that strengthening or changing, given that IP is so central to industries like semiconductors, AI, tech, and also just secondary to that, what role do you see the balance between the kind of mayor economies, these decentralized, smaller economic themes versus the kind of top-down, centralized political government playing
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes. now China finds itself as having the most cutthroat domestic competitive market in the world. Hundreds of EVs competing with each other, or any kind of product. So by the time they export them, they're quite good because they've survived that round of competition. So the only way to enhance one's innovative capacity, as I mentioned, that is going to be the most important goal for the Chinese leaders going forward, is IP protection. So they're trying to implement at a rapid pace this comprehensive framework. Now, of course, coming down, it's still not a mature system, so there'll be loopholes. But I think it's consistent with what the world wants, better IP protection of foreign companies. It's consistent with China's domestic goals anyways, because the domestic companies could be stealing each other's IP, and of course that would harm the innovation landscape. So I think on that, Chinese leaders are certainly consistent, or trying to push for that commitment. There was a follow-up question.
There was about the mare economy versus a much more top-down centralized system.
I think that it's very difficult to depart from that. Now, you can say that there's more political centralization, but who implements the policies? China is a very big country. Who actually monitors progress? Who checks, make sure that things happen? It's still the local governments. And this central and local relationship, this has actually been kind of a very interesting, complex, and nuanced relationship for hundreds, if not 1,000 years. So it goes back in history. So I don't see that model changing in the future.
Let's get some more questions from the audience. I saw hands up. Sir, you've been waiting patiently. Afterwards, the lady at the back afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My question is, the current, according to official figures, the current debt that China has is about $13 trillion. And I would like to know if you don't think that ending militarization of the country, and of course of the world, not only would solve the problems forever and end everything, not only wars in the world, but
this question about ending militarization and the vast expenditure, there's no sign of that, is there?
Unfortunately. I mean, I agree that the world is trapped in debt, everywhere. But just coming back to the fundamental core US-China problem, I don't think there's a core fundamental existential problem. I think there's a big gulf because of misunderstandings. But if we look at around the world, the real military conflicts that's happening, really, do we really need to see these two countries? There's nothing really at the core of their rivalry other than, I think, a lot of misunderstanding, economic competition. But you
don't believe in the Thucydides trap.
No,
this idea of the rise of Athens against Sparta.
I'd say that the rise of China did come as a shock, because of the pace, because of the scale. That was true in the economic landscape, but also in the political sphere. So I think that's something where the world was not ready for. But is it to the point that there could be military conflict between U.S. and China? I really, I don't believe in that kind of theories, because the U.S. and Americans and Chinese are more alike than we often like to admit.
Much the same sort of thing was talked about in 1913, 1914, that the intermeshing of the global economy was such that war was absolutely unthinkable.
So that's quite gloomy outlook.
Sorry about that one. Right, another question. The lady at the back, thank you.
Hi, Keyu, how are you? We shared some similar education background, not only LSE, but also I graduated from Renmin University of China. So it's very lovely to meet you. I read the book earlier this year, but I wasn't as positive as you are in this book. Mm-hmm. For China, I'm quite negative in a way, and two concerns at the moment. One is the super low fertility rate in China. And I recently met the principal of a nursery in China, and he said in China right now, nursery reduce at the rate of 8% every year. What does that mean for the future of China? And the other thing is China, I feel, is further and further away, disconnected with the rest of the world. For example, the ChatGPT, we know the exciting news of the 4.0 launched, but ChatGPT is totally banned in China. How do you think on that? Thanks.
Thank you so much. First of all, fertility rate.
Fertility, well, people are not having as many kids. And I think that this is a real social problem with education costs being so exorbitantly high, the fact that housing prices are very high, and the fact that one-child policy have also changed people's preferences, right? No longer very used to having big families. And also coming back to the youth, the anxiety, jobs, prosperity, prospects of a good future. I think these all play a role, which is why the country at least wants to tackle some of that. Lowering fertility as an income rises is actually a natural trend. It's just that it's happened much faster than China. So I think these social issues are big issues in China. And China, despite everything and despite what you say about my optimism, it is becoming an increasingly more complex country, and also more complex country to manage, because people's preferences are starting to reveal in different directions, and they're not just caring about the basic stuff. So I think that is the great social challenge. I think that my view is more of a cautious optimism, in the sense that I don't think the Western views of why China economy is going to collapse or falter is the right reasons. I think if we want to critique China, we should also critique it in the right ways, because there are real fallacies, there are real challenges. And for one, to mention, I think China is totally ready to be a totally market-driven economy. The state, for whatever role it played, and that was important, early stages of development, it needs to recede, because at this point, competition is high. You wanted to say something here.
No, I read this in your book, It's Time for the State to Recede. I'm just looking for those examples in history where the state goes, you know what, it's time for us to step back, we'll give up power.
Well, not political power, but certainly if you look at the data, right, the decline of the state share is there. And innovation, that's the one key metric. 80% of the key innovation is driven by the private sector. And the Chinese government knows that it's not up to the SOEs to do the real innovation, the cutting edge technologies innovation. So I think in that sense, I think it's wrong to just say the state suppresses the private sector because of all the recent policies that we've seen. But in terms of some strategic issues or political issues, there is definitely more control in China that we've seen in the recent years than we've ever seen in the past couple of decades.
The second point was about disconnectivity, about, I think you mentioned ChatGPT in particular, about sort of barriers going up and sort of cutting China off. What do you make of that?
Well, the tech competition, the AI competition, but China has its own ecosystem. There are lots of companies that are trying to come out with large language models and doing the same. And there's also a parallel world, I think, outside of the Western countries that we also have to take into account. Yeah. So I don't really see that China can be actually realistically just cut out of that system that is actually pretty predominantly important.
Let's take another question from our online audience. From your perspective, what are the key factors driving the improvement, it says here, in Britain-China relations, and what potential opportunities and challenges do you foresee in this regard?
Well, looking at this country, we've already had Brexit. And one of the reasons we said, one of the things the country said it would do is it can work with more global partners. I think that it would include countries like China and India. So I think from a pragmatic level, from economic relations, I think there's lots of opportunities. And China is very open. China actually sees the UK as one of the most open economies for, given the past Chinese investments here, trade, services, Chinese students, many, many more are coming to the UK rather than to the US. So if there was really a mindset of let's keep the competition and collaboration separate and know that they can coexist and, discuss and argue with China on things that are relevant, but also collaborate on China with important things like the green transition and other things, students, investment, mutual investment, there's absolutely that possibility, and China's very open to it. But so I think it's also up to this country and what the leaders, that kind of tone that is set. If we look at within Europe, there's a huge amount of heterogeneity on its attitude towards China, whether it's Germany, but now also with Macron, we've seen not really all the identical attitudes toward China.
Okay, thank you very much. From the audience, if we could. I see gentleman right at the back, and after that, the lady on the edge there. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Sir.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the sharing so much knowledge tonight. So my question relates to RMB. So recently news came out saying U.S. trying to potentially kick some of the Chinese bank out of the SWIFT system because obviously some of the companies in China facilitate or support this certain component to Russians' war equipment. So firstly, what's your view on this? Do you think this is serious, or do you think it's just news? And this brings to my second question: is the internationalization of RMB. So I think it's strategically China want to internationalize it, right? And we see gold price get supported. I mean, from second half of last year and this year still very supported. And so do you think? So what's your view on internationalization of RMB? And do you think the internationalization of RMB is correlated with a supported gold price? Thank you.
I answer that on a broader level, which is the weaponization of the dollar is a very real thing. It's not just in the instance of Russia. I was just in Zimbabwe a few weeks ago. They sanctioned Zimbabwe. There are many, many countries that they will sanction. So I think the parallel move towards coming up with an alternative system to SWIFT and to the dollar is there. The efforts are there. Now, the challenge is that the dollar is so dominant, right? But it's not just in terms of goods and trade. It's the dollar in the banking system, right? People borrow and lend in dollars. And behind that is this massive, the depth, the breadth, and the liquidity of U.S. financial system. So that is really at the core of why the dollar is so dominant. This is why the RMB, despite the internationalization efforts, it's still very difficult to substantially increase the usage of RMB. But we do see certain external shocks. Let's say a geopolitical event. Let's say Russia. Let's say trade invoicing change to denominate in the yuan. That you see tiny percentage increases in the usage of RMB. But in the short term, nothing is going to displace the dollar.
Thank you, sir. I love your contrast between something being serious or just news. I'll take that back to Broadcasting House. Thank you. Madam, thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you very much for a fascinating conversation. You reference in your book that people in China are more likely to prefer security over freedom compared to the majority of Americans who would choose freedom over security. You mentioned that young people are studying abroad, are becoming more open-minded, and differing in their beliefs compared to their parents' generation. Do you see any change in this perspective, or could it be entrenched further due to geopolitical tensions, domestic tensions?
Well, thank you for that. It's not as easy to see a big change currently with the new generation. It's a few years that these international surveys have been done. But I say this is that the young people do observe what's happening around the world. They do look at Western democracies and how they're faring, right? If they see huge inspiration in these places or democracies that are kind of transposed onto native soil, I think that would be they think twice about what the right model is for China. I think if you ask whether these people want a free and open society, I think the answer is absolutely yes. But do they believe that the Western-style democracy is necessarily the answer to China's system? I think that's still a question mark, especially if they're drawing on experiences observed abroad. I do think that cultures can change. I do think that values can change, even though they are slow moving. So I do think that the new generation, because what's urgent for their parents is no longer the practical necessities every day, that they do aspire to a slightly different and more open and life. So I think that is slowly occurring in any case. But some of these practical difficulties I mentioned before, they have to face and encounter, including not having kids because of the social anxiety that comes first. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll take one more question if we can. Madam, in the middle there. Thank you very much.
Hello, Keyu. I'm actually the typical group come from Chinese Gen Z group, which study in the abroad for several years. I'm actually looking for opportunities to start up my own business after several years studying in the UK, in China. Could you give me some advice?
All yours. Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, I think that we enjoy enormous privilege being exposed to both the Eastern cultures and education system and the Western ones, and there's really so much to absorb and learn from both. And so I think, your generation is much more entrepreneurial than mine, so I have to learn from you. But I think that keeping this open mind, and this is something that I was struck because when I got to the US high school, the first thing was they said question authority. Oh my God, what does that mean? Ask questions, question everything. And second is have a really open mind. And I think to some degree that's also that's also a little bit lacking in today's world, despite so much information that we have. So I think that is the only advice that I can possibly give to you.
On that, we will close. And on that phrase, open mind, I'd like to thank you so much for opening our minds. I can't go on enough about how good the book is. So rush out and get it. I think it's now out in paperback. Keyu, thank you so much for a great conversation. Thank you to all of you here and to those online who've put such interesting questions to us as well. A big thanks to Intelligence Squared. Very big thanks to Guinness Global Investors who have made this possible. We're going to leave it there. Have a lovely evening. Good night and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Real pleasure. Thank you very much.